The Waking Tree by C. Don McCallum, Chapter 15 SHH. Jared slept sitting up in his recliner, his feet raised and pointing towards the outside world. There was no time where he dwelled now, and space was as malleable as clay and people. Even in his sleep, he took his thick fingers out of his pockets and molded dream state replicas of the people and events that have been stored for some time in neat boxes on the shelves of his memory. Mother, brother boxes that should be readied for burial. That one hot summer, he had not guessed the chain of events would give him the technique of a sculptor who could pull people's lives and emotions, bodies, in directions unforeseeable to them. That summer, he learned about the fine art of calculating, of deceiving people to believe what he wanted them to believe. He learned how to mold others into believing that his way was perfect and desirable, that nothing under the sun or moon was to be pursued unless it was first approved by his excellent taste for all things good and true, and they would all believe him. They all would fall under the spell of his seductive touch, his strong hold beating, slipping and scoring them all into his vision of what they should be. He used to be such a sweet boy. He still is deep down. Abra had believed. There was no doubt of that. She saw his hands guiding her away to safety, away from the threats of her mother's searing stares and away from the lip-licking boys with eyes that meandered their way into her white cotton blouse, up and under her red skirt. His hands, she believed, would steer her like a wheel through the seemingly impenetrable maelstrom. He would guide her to the safety of the unspeaking mind, where the only voice she heard would be her own, and the volume of the songs that made her dance could be adjusted with a dial or a polite request. She had not expected it at all. First, there had been Darnell's biting screech. She should have known then that Jared's strength had been the illusion. Hallucinations aren't always figments of the imagination. Sometimes it's our reality that can play tricks on us, twisting and driving us to places unseen and undesirable. She knew that now. His lips, too, had been moist and sweetened by his tongue. She had seen it, or at least she thinks that now when she looks at him out of the corner of her eye, trying not to be seen as an adversary or spy. In his chair, Jared pulled a leg up, rested a foot on the extended pad, and wiggled it in an unconscious jitter. The chair shook with him. No one would suspect the depth of his sleep. His first believer had been his brother. The two boys would run around the house, down the curve of the country road where they lived, and through hay-filled pastures in a mirthful quest for nothing in particular. Curiosity was the game they would play. How high could the pine cones go? Over the power lines? Above the highest tree? What animals lived under rocks? Could the paint on the back porch door be scratched off with just their fingernails, or would they need a rock, stick, a sharp piece of metal? What was their mama and Mr. Abbott talking about inside for so long on such a cool, beautiful day? This breeze won't last much longer, Jared told his little brother. There's nothing worse than wasting a day like today, Christopher said in a louder voice than usual, aiming it toward the screen door. He wanted to see Mr. Abbott too. Christopher shaded his eyes, letting his brother stand between him and the distant, glaring sun. "Do you think they're talking about getting married?" he whispered. "I don't know," Jared said, tossing a pebble he had pried from the grooves of his rubber shoes on the thick green grass. "We'll just have to see." Jared looked at Christopher's lowered head. His hair swirled in smooth brown strands from the back of his head, catching the light in patches of red. Christopher kicked the ground, unearthing tiny particles of soil under the friction of his shoes. "Let's go out to the woods," Jared said, standing. Christopher jumped up to follow. There were only 2 years between the two boys, but Christopher saw his brother as a sage to be learned from and studied. They trod on the spongy ground to the dark canopy of trees that lay just on the edge of their yard. Their mama said that their daddy had made these little roads, had cleared all of the pathways through which they now walked. They snapped stray branches that attempted to block their movements through their woods. My horse apples drew them to me. Their mama didn't like it much when they went out there alone. The three of them would often retrace the trail together, though. Sometimes they would think they saw a man, machete or rake in hand, creating the path under their feet, but the images of his sweating brow and damp, stained shirt remained in their minds. There was no reason to talk about it. Trees don't like all our talking, Jared told Christopher as he sat in the clearing around the little used stone fire pit. So we have to be quiet. The boys lifted and rearranged the stones of the pow-wow, blackening their hands on the spent wood held within the wall of rock and air. Christopher would not have remembered the fires there with their father, the red and yellow flames rising high and popping, cinders flying randomly into the air, and sometimes onto hands resting on thighs or hands on their way to do something, or onto the cheeks of a turned face. Sometimes they'd put on a limb that I dropped and watched the vigorous light show of my wood ecstatic. Jared remembered little of it himself. He didn't know what words had been spoken here, if there had been any at all. He could only hear the S and the T sounds and the A and E sounds. Ooh, GHHH, he thought he had heard someone say. Back then he'd been too little for language to fit in his mouth, for it to play his tiny eardrums. Hadn't he also heard the sounds of fire, wind, and trees? It was all the same. He had no specific memory in mind to share with Christopher when he said, "We used to come out with Daddy sometimes, remember?" A strobing slideshow in Jared's head were all that remained of their father. He threw a horse apple up against a rock to split it open. The white milk oozed. "Yeah," Christopher said, letting a pale daddy long legs tarry on his leg. He had no such memory himself. Daddy was a man in pictures without a voice, without actions, or even a real name. "Yeah," he said again. He only knew about their walks to the pow-wow because he had been told. "Remember," Jared would say, too scared to forget what little he could still see in his memory. He pulled open the horse apple and got sticky. Jared reached his hand across the fire and thumped the spider from Christopher's light brown skin. "Hey," Christopher squealed. "I wanted him there." Jared sneered a sneaky smile and shoved his brother with his glue-tacky hands. "Stupid," he said, pulling the horse apple apart, one seed at a time. "You're stupid and ugly." Jared thought it was funny, gave his little brother another push. "Stop it," Christopher's eyebrows furrowed as he tried to stay upright under the force of his brother's strength. Jared pushed again. 2 extra years of climbing and throwing had done much for those taut young muscles. Jared laughed louder, longer. He did not hear the steps behind him. It wasn't until Bernadine seized him and shook them both, wailing for peace, that he even realized that he was doing anything wrong. A game, that's all it had been. "I didn't hurt him," Jared griped, dropping the horse apple. "Well, I don't like it. Not one bit," their mama screeched. "Now get in that house and clean up. Neither one of you are stepping 1 foot out of that house until you straighten up and learn how to act right. Do you hear me?" "Yes, ma'am," the boys chorused, a cappella expect for the hum of the trees. Bernadine stormed in her fury down the path, instinctively handing the branches off to whichever boy it was following closest behind her. Jared caught each one tight against his dirty hands. The branches swatted and slapped him, but they did not hurt. And off to Christopher behind him, he sent them flying without waiting to notice where the tiny boy's eyes, face, and chest were. All Christopher's screaming had got him into trouble. He didn't want to spend the whole rest of the day inside on a day like today. He had plans. He wanted to catch crawdads in the creek and take them to the other side of the big road and watch them all walk back in their blind search for their muddy homes. Now his mama would have him folding clothes and rearranging his closet or some dumb chore like that. Jared turned and saw his brother barely able to keep up with the pace and the angry branches. Jared caught a branch from his mother. Ugly, he turned and mouthed at Christopher. A hiss of an S slid out past his teeth. He pushed the branch forward and let it fly behind him as he passed. Stupid. When the branch hit his little brother, Jared could do nothing but stop and watch as Christopher fell into 5 separate pieces. His arms and legs dropped bloodless and without sound to the floor of the trail. Staring, he watched as his brother's scattered remains, still alive and perplexed, took root and spread in a new growing green. Jared jolted in his chair. Christopher, Jared said, feeling his brother's name on his lips for the first time in years, for the first time since his mother's death. Wish says, wake up. Wish says, hide. Kneeling by the side of her bed, Jared marveled at her steady breathing. Josephine had been created by him, and now she lives. So easily the breath could leave her body, but he would not force it from her. She was the one, the only one he trusted. In her silence and small movements, she had never once betrayed him. She loved, and she loved completely. Even though she had the same love for all things, Jared only felt it coming in his direction. Now and then he felt it wane in the light of his alcoholic stumblings, but he didn't notice it at all because he held her love in his mind as one reason not to pick up a bottle in the morning when he first woke up. Today he would remain sober for her, the angel that he had made. In Josephine's dream, she sat in my branches with her grandmother behind her, pulling her hair up in strands and letting them fall in long pieces, eager to return to the gentle shoulders of the little girl. Her hair greeted the curves of her back with smiles and laughter that made her shiver from their love, and how their joy echoed through the woods, bouncing off trees that would absorb and send it to the clouds and to lungs, brains, and hearts everywhere. Josephine liked it when the love returned to her. Then she sent it right back again to her hair dangling in her grandmother's hands. Like breathing, my dropping fruit thundered. Of course, Josephine knew her daddy was watching her. His cloud had appeared in her sky a moment ago, cumulus and looming, his lugubrious rain ready to saturate the soil. It's almost time for a good shower, Bernadine said. Shouldn't we go inside? Lightning won't get to us here. Josephine jumped down to the ground, preparing for one last run over the dry, rocky soil before it muddied under the sky. Jared whispered in his daughter's ear. Her eyes eased open. Good morning. You sleep good? Josephine nodded and smiled. The dream melted into the walls and the rumbling cloud was silent. She touched her daddy's hand resting beside her on the bed. He was burning. Jared turned his hand palm up and slid it under, wrapped it around Josephine's hand. She didn't like the sweatiness of him, but she knew that with her touch it would go, making him almost warm. Did Mama come back? Jared's smile faded, and he looked down at the pink sheets. He almost shook his head. Josephine felt it rising up the back of his neck and stop against his will. Instead, he said, Did I ever tell you about? And that too stopped against the thick filter on his mouth. He wanted to tell her about his brother, about Christopher, about how she reminded him of that tender way his brother lived and breathed. But instead he looked at her eyes and saw for the first time how the black of her pupils perfectly laid against the spiraling blue. And he said, My mother would have loved you so much. He touched her virgin pink skin and watered it with his sweat. Love the electric rain. Love the rain electric. Thank you for listening to The Waking Tree by C. Don McCallum. If you're enjoying this story, please consider sharing it with someone you know. And please like the video and subscribe to this channel to help others discover these stories.